Hey everyone, Mr. MC here. Recently we had this lap time challenge, and unlike a lot of the other lap time challenges, with this one you can use any Group 4 car that you have or that you can rent. And with Group 4 cars, there's 33 of them, so there's quite a bit of choices that you can make in which car you want to use for this lap time challenge. And for those that don't know, with these lap time challenges, it's basically you versus the world record holder. So you're trying to have your time within a certain time range. So for example, if you want to go for the gold lap time, you're trying to get a lap time that is better than a 207.3. But be aware that when the world record time changes, so does the gold, silver, and bronze requirement times. Now, even though we have 33 cars to choose from, there is a meta car, or the best car, and once people find out what that meta car is, almost everyone is going to use it, which, well, you can see right now the Lamborghini Huracan is that meta car for this lap time challenge. And even just scrolling around, you can see that there's a lot of Huracans getting used. Every now and then a different car will pop up, but yeah, there's one clear car that's pretty much dominating this lap time challenge. So we'll do a lap throughout Lago Maggiore using the Lamborghini Huracan Group 4, and I was initially going to make the lap guide, but I ended up getting a really silly idea and ended up turning into this monstrosity of a video. But anyways, you're braking at around the 100 meter board. Going to go down to second gear, and you can go down to first gear for this pretty sharp turn. And one of the surprising things is that you can get on the throttle pretty early with this car, which is already going to be a bit of an advantage over the other cars. Go down to second gear, back up to third gear. I went down to second gear for a bit more rotation, and then exited on third gear, shifting when the shift bar fills up and starts to blink. This turn you got to be a bit careful, got to brake a little bit early, because if you are a bit too aggressive on the brakes, the car does risk getting into a nasty slide, and you want to try to avoid that so you don't scrub up too much speed. Here, track limits are pretty much more of a suggestion, because you can do this and you're still within track limits. Even with this curve right here, you can just monster truck those curves and you're still within track limits. You're going to bring yourself towards the left, and you're going to brake. I think it's before the 50 meter board. We'll see once we get there. Just hanging out on the back straight, and yeah, it's going to be before the 50 meter board. That's where you're going to start to brake. You can really cut this curve right here at the big banky boy, just trying to avoid the gravel on the left. And this part can be taken flat out. There are some cars where it's a bit difficult to take these S's flat out, but for the Huracan, it's no problem at all. Gotta brake before the 50 meter board. This one's a bit tricky because, as you saw right there, it is possible to get the car into a slide and scrub off a little too much speed. Trying to go for a late apex right here so you don't lose too much speed again. And this last turn is a bit of a tricky one because it's downhill braking, and you can cut the living heck out of those curves on the left. Just trying to carry as much speed as you can towards the finish line. And with this, I was able to poke into 204s, so a 204.9, and it's pretty nice. But that's when I eventually got curious and decided, hey, we have 33 cars we can use. Is it possible to do the following things with all 33 cars? Can we get a gold time, which is a 207.3 at the time, go under 207, and go under 206. If a car can do all three things, then I think it was a pretty good car to use for this lap time challenge. And something I want to make clear: one, I'm doing this in no particular order, and two, I'm not comparing the cars with each other. I'm just trying to see if the car has just enough pace to get a 205. So we're starting off with the Mazda Atenza Group 4. This car was able to get into the mid 205s, although this car was a bit understeered for my liking, so I guess that was the only drama I had with this car. But other than that, it wasn't too bad of a car to drive, getting a mid 205, so not too bad there. Next up is the Alfa Romeo 155. This car was a bit lively coming out of the lower speed corners, where if I'm getting out of turn number 2 and I get too aggressive on the throttle, the car is going to go into a crazy slide. It looks cool, but it does waste you a bit of time. But other than that, this car, as long as I was careful on the throttle, wasn't too crazy to drive, getting a 205.8, so it was a viable car to use for this lap time challenge. Now, the Alfa Romeo 4C Group 4 was a pretty fun car to drive. The only thing is that you have to be careful going over the curbs, especially on the S's in sector 2, because if you drove over them just wrong, the car will not like that. It'll unsettle itself and you'll suddenly find yourself driving into a barrier. So that's something that you have to be careful of in the 4C. The Aston Martin V8 Vantage gets a 205.7, and it didn't take me that many tries to get this time, and this car actually felt pretty nice to drive. I thought it was going to be pretty understeer, but no, I was pretty pleasantly surprised. Again, felt really nice to drive, so I had a pretty easy time trying to get this car into the 205. So this car definitely worked for this lap time challenge. However, when it comes to the Audi TT Cup, this was a bit of a miserable car to drive. I was able to just poke into the 205, so yes, this car does work for this lap time challenge, but it is going to take a bit of time to get this car into the 205s, at least for me. And this car is a front wheel drive, so it understeered a lot, and that was where I really started to struggle. Trying to get back on the throttle, the car refuses to turn. Trying to trail brake, the car refuses to turn. So yeah, so that was not a fun time. The BMW M4 also pokes into the 205s. This car makes me feel a bit sad because back in Gran Turismo Sport, this was a pretty decent car to drive. Although one weird thing about this car is that you have to shift well before the shift bar on the bottom of the screen even starts to fill up. This car nowadays, it feels a bit sluggish to drive, at least when I was driving it around, so it made me feel sad about that. And it's going to be a similar story with the Chevrolet Corvette. Again, to me, it felt pretty sluggish to drive. It did take me a bit of time to get into the 205s, and that also applies to the BMW M4. But still, I was able to get these two into the 205s, so they do work for, or they did work pretty well for this lap time challenge. Is just that it might take a little bit of time to make it work. However, the GT by Citroen was a pretty fun car to drive, getting a 205.6, so this one didn't take too much time to get into the 205s. The mid-speed corners, so for example in the last two sectors and in the second sector, feels pretty fun to drive there. And I know I do see this car every now and then as an off-meta pick. So yeah, this car very viable for this lap time challenge. Now for the Dodge Danger Noodle, this one was also pretty viable for this lap time challenge, getting into the 205.8. It is a bit on the understeer side, so I had to be a bit careful when entering a corner, but once you get that taken care of, then 205 was inevitable. Didn't take too much time, and of course this is my baby, so yeah, I had a fun time driving this car around. Now we're gonna go on over to the Ford Mustang. This car surprised me a bit. I thought this car was going to be really sluggish, but it ended up being a bit of a decent car to drive. I did have to be careful exiting the lower speed corners. So for example, turn number 2 right here, if I was too aggressive on the throttle, the car was going to really step out and might spin out. But once I got that taken care of, then this car ended up being a pretty fun car to drive and ended up getting a 205.6. The Honda NSX, an absolute pleasure to drive. I love driving this car around. The only thing that makes me sad was that I ended up getting the 205 pretty early on, so I didn't get to spend more time with this car. Yeah, I know this car sometimes is an off-meta pick, and if there's ever a time where you get to drive this car around, definitely do so. It goes through the corners really well. Really fun car to drive. And this is where the awkward thing happens, where I completely forget about recording the rest of the cars until I think it was like 2 days before the lap time challenge ended. So I kind of had to rush through the rest of them. And the Hyundai Genesis. Now this one's a bit of an interesting one for me because I think this was the first time I've driven this car in Gran Turismo 7. So it has been a really hot minute since I've driven this car. It doesn't drive that well for me. Yeah, it felt pretty sluggish, but luckily I was able to just poke into the 205, so this car did work. And Windfire, if you're listening, hopefully you don't balk me for this. But anyways, moving on over to the Jaguar F-Type Group 4. This one, I think it didn't take me that long to get into the 205s. I think it took me maybe 2 or 3 attempts. So yeah, it didn't take too much time, and pretty quickly poked into the 205s, and I was able to call a day there with this car. And I just want to point out that all I care about is trying to get these cars into the 205s. It doesn't have to be a perfect lap. If a car can poke into the 205s and that's good enough for me, I think it's a very viable car for this lap time challenge. And the reason why I say 205 instead of saying 206 is because I think 205 was the guaranteed safe time. So if you got a 205, then you basically don't have to worry about your time getting knocked out into the silver territory. You can pretty much just rest easy and just move on to whatever you want to do next. Now the Mazda 3, pretty understreet, but still able to poke into the 205s. The Mitsubishi Lancer Evo was a pretty easy car to drive, quickly getting into the mid 205s. And here, yeah, you can be pretty aggressive getting on the throttle out of the lower speed corners, and the car was just going to be like, okay, I'll go ahead and do what you want to do. So pretty forgiving car to drive, although it is a bit strange that this car only has 5 gears, and I think this is the only Group 4 car with 5 gears. The Nissan Silvio S15, pretty fun car to drive. Honestly, I thought this car was going to be pretty slow. I thought I was going to struggle to get into the 205s, but nope, this car, it was able to hold its own, quickly getting into the 205.6s, so it was definitely a viable car for this lap time challenge. And another quick note, if you're interested in having me stitch together all the best laps from all 33 cars, do let me know and I can get that going. Make one gigantic video and I'll put it as an unlisted video. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. The Nissan GT-R, really easy car to drive. I was able to get into the 205s pretty quickly with this one, and it was a lot less understeery than I expected. Not sure if it's just because I was already driving around quite a bit, but yeah, really easy car to drive. The Renault Megane Trophy might not have the top speed to go down the straights, but oh my goodness, its handling was pretty darn awesome, so you made up all the time there. So yeah, so you can imagine going through the turns, this car just feels amazing to drive, and I was able to quite easily get into the 205s, getting a 205.744. The Subaru WRX felt a bit similar to that of the Lancer Evo, but this car did feel a bit easier to drive. At least this car has 6 gears, but you don't use 6 gear here. But yeah, getting a 205.7, so really easy car to drive, really forgiving to drive. So if you're dipping your toes into Group 4, the Subaru WRX is definitely a car to check out, because yeah, this car will take pretty good care of you. The Toyota Supra did take a little bit of time for me to try to get into the 205s. I'm gonna be honest, I think that was mostly just skill issue on my end. I had to be a bit careful getting back on the throttle out of turn number 2, because as you saw right there, the car stepped out a bit, and I kept trying to be too aggressive, and I'll just end up spinning out. But other than that, once I got a bit more time behind the wheel of this car, I was able to get into the 205s. The Toyota 86 That one also took a little bit of time to poke into the 205s, but it didn't take too much time, so it basically just came down to me just trying to get used to this car. And actually, I'm pretty curious as to when I last drove this car. I think it was just a pretty long time since I've driven the 86 Group 4. But yeah, a viable car for this Laptime Challenge. The Lexus RCF. This one felt a little strange for me to drive. I can't quite put my finger on why it feels that way, but yeah, I didn't have the most fun driving this car. I think it just overall felt a bit weird for me to drive, but still able to get into the 205. So yeah, this car definitely does work for this Laptime Challenge. Now, another car where I'm probably going to say it was mainly me having skill issues was the Ferrari 458, where for some reason I wasn't gelling that well with this car, which is weird because normally back then I gelled pretty well with the 458 Group 4, but when I tried it here, for some reason things weren't quite working out. But either way, still got into the 205.9, so this car does work for this Laptime Challenge. I think I just need more time behind the wheel of that car. The Bugatti Veyron was the car that surprised me the most, because I thought this car was going to be super understeery and super miserable to drive, but no. Ended up quickly getting a 205.2. So yeah, this car, it was actually fun to drive. This car was stupidly quick going down the back street. I think I hit 153 miles per hour, whereas with a lot of the other cars I was hitting 150 miles per hour. Yeah, the Veyron definitely coming by surprise. The McLaren 650S felt a bit sluggish for me. I think part of it just has to do with because I haven't driven this car in a while. I know with this car you have to shift pretty early. I think you have to shift when the shift bar is around halfway full. At least I think that's how it was back in GT Sport. I'm not sure if it's still the same case here, but I went ahead and did that. The Porsche Cayman is a car that kind of gets on my nerves, and it has nothing to do with how it drives because it drove pretty fine to me. It actually has to do with how it sounds, because it sounds like a freaking vacuum cleaner, so I try to stay away from that car. I mean, just listen to it. Yeah, I just cannot get over it. Like, it gets on my nerves for some reason. I mean, it's almost as bad as that of the X2019, except the X2019 makes you get tinnitus. But anyways, the Genesis G70 gets a 205.3. This car has a field day with medium and high speed corners, and as you saw right there, going through sector 2, this car just has a great time there. And I think this is probably one of the other top picks for this Laptime Challenge, as this car, all-wheel drive and medium high-speed corners, it just has a field day there. Another car that caught me by surprise was the SLS AMG. I thought this car was going to be a bit sluggish, but no, this was a pretty quick car, quickly getting a 205.3. So yeah, this car didn't take that long. Felt pretty awesome to drive once I started to drive it around, and was able to quickly get the time requirements out of the way. Now here comes another problem child where we're using the Volkswagen Scirocco, another front wheel drive. Not the easiest to drive because it just loves to understeer, and you could probably guess which cars were the problem childs or problem children for me. Yeah, they're the front wheel drive cars. I just did not have a good time with them because they just love to understeer so much that the cars that ended up giving me way too much trouble were all front wheel drive cars. So we'll start off with the Suzuki Swift, and with this one I actually had a 206.1, but for some stupid reason I forgot to save the replay, so the next best replay I had for it was a 206.4. And yeah, this car, it just feels like it has no power, and I think they even nerfed this car with a recent-ish update. I think they added weight to the car, which is only going to make it even slower and a bit more painful to drive. But yeah, this car, it just doesn't have that much pace. I mean, I'm surprised I was even able to get into the low 206s, and I still wish I had that replay. But the S's, oh my goodness, the S's were a huge pain to deal with. Even with this car, I had to lift off a throttle to make it through the S's, and even there I almost went off the track. And yeah, it was not that fun to drive. Another car that also gave me too much trouble was a Peugeot RCZ Group 4, where it feels like whenever I press down on the throttle, all it does is make noise and not go faster. And yeah, this was another very painful car to drive. But with this one, I was able to get a 206.2, so kind of just shy of missing off of the 205s. And yes, this car does understeer as well, and it just feels super sluggish to drive. And even at the end of sector 1, or pretty much sector 2, so with a turn 5 and then the S's that follow shortly after, oh my goodness, the car just understeers a lot there. So you have to be really careful with your inputs, otherwise you're just going to understeer and you lose so much time. Not a fun car to drive, the Peugeot RCZ. However, the Renault Megane FF, as this car is a front engine 4-wheel drive, was the most painful car for me to drive, more than the Swift, more than the RCZ, as this car, at least to me, this car feels like it is the definition of understeer, where this car just doesn't want to turn. You have to be extremely conscious of your inputs, otherwise this car is just going to refuse to turn and you'll suddenly find yourself going off track. And I don't even remember when was the last time this car was ever good in sport mode. It might have been back in the early days of Gran Turismo Sport, but other than that, I just cannot recall when this car was ever good. This car needs love. This car has been forgotten, and yeah, this car just does not feel good to drive. Even through here, I have to lift off of the throttle just to try to get this car around the S's, almost going off of the track. And yeah, it just, me having to do that, lifting off a throttle for the S's, where with a lot of the other cars I'm taking it flat out, it's not fun. I don't like that. And I also had a lot of moments where I kept understeering onto the gravel because I kept thinking, okay, I can get back on the throttle now, and suddenly I find myself on the gravel. I think I even lifted off of the throttle for the S's. That's how understeery this car is. It's awful. And then here I have to be even more careful getting on the throttle, because if I get too aggressive on the throttle or I get on the throttle too early, I'm going to find myself on the wall or on the grass. Just not a fun car to drive. It'll be amazing if this car ever sees another moment where it becomes a viable car, but for me, it is not. Yeah, this car was pretty miserable to drive. But there we go. I will say, all 33 cars I was able to at least get into the 206s, and then for 30 cars I was able to get into the 205s with them. So yeah, I was able to get a gold medal with all 33 cars, but there were some that were a bit too painful to drive, but the others, it might take a little bit of time, it might take a bit longer of time, but 205s were definitely possible with most of the Group 4 cars. I have no idea why I decided to do this. I think it was just a really silly idea, and I was like, hey, let's do this stupid idea. Oh man. But if you like this video, you can press the like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. But that's all for me. This is Mr. MCA, and I'll see you in the next video.